When arrogant businessman Thaddeus Montgomery forces waitress Zora Willis to play piano at an upscale restaurant to humiliate her for his entertainment, he expects fumbling notes and embarrassment. Instead, her extraordinary talent silences the room and awakens something long forgotten in him. What begins as a cruel power play becomes an unexpected journey of redemption when Thaddeus discovers Zora's connection to his family's past and the unfinished symphony that binds their stories together. Zora Willis balanced 5 plates along, her arm as she weaved through the crowded dining room of the Riverstone Club. The weight felt familiar after her double shift, but the ache in her feet was getting harder to ignore. Still, she kept her smile fixed in place. Tips at Riverstone were good. Better than good when she served tables in the private section, like tonight. "Careful with those plates, darling," called Mr. Peterson, a regular who always had too much to drink. "Wouldn't want you to drop our fancy dinner." Zora nodded politely, but didn't slow down. She'd been carrying plates since she was 14, helping her grandmother serve at church functions. She hadn't dropped one yet. The private dining room glowed with warm light from crystal chandeliers. 5 men in expensive suits sat around a table covered in white linen. They were celebrating something big, a business deal that had closed that afternoon, from what she'd overheard. "Gentlemen, who needs a refill?" Zora asked, setting down each plate with care. The man at the head of the table held up his glass without looking at her. Thaddeus Montgomery. Everyone at Riverstone knew him. He owned half the buildings downtown, and never tipped more than 15%, no matter how good the service. "The Bordeaux," he said, "and bring another bottle." "Right away, sir," Zora replied, filling his glass. As she poured, Thaddeus finally looked up. His eyes narrowed on her hands. "What happened to your fingers?" he asked suddenly. Zora almost spilled the wine. She finished pouring before answering. "Nothing, sir." "Those calluses," Thaddeus persisted, pointing to her fingertips. "I've seen those before." The other men at the table were watching now. Zora felt her cheeks grow warm. "They're nothing," she said again, tucking her hands behind her back. Thaddeus smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Gentlemen, our waitress here is trying to hide something." He turned to his friends. "Those are pianist's calluses." One of the men snorted. "A pianist? Here?" "Our waitress fancies herself a musician," Thaddeus continued, his voice carrying, "How charming." Heads turned from nearby tables. Zora stood still, clutching the wine bottle like a shield. "I played some. When I was younger," she said quietly. "She played some, gentlemen," Thaddeus echoed, raising his eyebrows. "Probably chopsticks and heart and soul, I'd imagine." The men laughed, all except one, the youngest at the table, who stared into his plate. "I should get your next course," Zora said, trying to step away. "Wait." Thaddeus held up his hand. "We're celebrating tonight. We could use some entertainment." Zora's stomach knotted. "Sir?" Thaddeus pointed across the room to where a grand piano sat on a small platform. It was used on Friday and Saturday nights when the club hired a professional pianist. Tonight was Wednesday. "Play something for us," he said. It wasn't a request. "I don't think that's—" "I insist." Thaddeus's smile widened. "Unless those calluses are from something else. Perhaps I'm mistaken." One of his friends chuckled. "Maybe she just has rough hands. Not everyone has a personal manicurist, Thad." More laughter. "I'll give you an extra 50 in your tip," Thaddeus said, already reaching for his wallet. "Consider it a performance fee." Zora looked toward the bar, hoping to catch her manager's eye. But Kevin was busy with another customer, his back turned. "Sir, I'm not sure the club allows—" "I'm a member," Thaddeus cut her off. And Dominic would have no problem with providing some entertainment for his best customers. He dangled a $50 bill between two fingers. Unless you're embarrassed, because you can't really play? The other tables had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now. $50 was half what she'd make in tips all night. It was Elijah's science textbook for next semester. "One song," she said, finally. Thaddeus clapped his hands together. "Excellent. Gentlemen, our waitress will now perform." He raised his voice even more. "Attention, everyone. We have a special treat tonight. Our server, what's your name, dear?" "Zora," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Zora here claims to be a pianist. She'll be performing for us now." People at nearby tables turned to stare. Zora felt dizzy. She hadn't touched a piano in months, not since the community center where she volunteered had to sell theirs. She set down the wine bottle and walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last. Behind her, she heard Thaddeus stage whisper to his friends, "This should be amusing." The piano bench was cold beneath her as she sat, the glossy black surface of the piano reflected the chandelier light like stars. It was a Steinway, probably worth more than her apartment building. Zora took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. The ivory felt cool and smooth, familiar despite everything. She closed her eyes. What would Grandma Ruby say? Zora could almost hear her voice. "Play from here, baby girl." A phantom touch on her heart. "Not from here." A tap on her head. Zora opened her eyes. The dining room had gone completely silent. She could feel Thaddeus watching, waiting for her to fumble or freeze. His smug smile burned into her back. Her fingers hovered above the keys. What should she play? Something simple would be safer. But a small flame of anger ignited inside her chest. This man thought he could humiliate her for his entertainment. She thought of Grandma Ruby again, of the hours they'd spent at the old upright piano with the chipped keys and wobbly bench, of the way music had been their language when words failed. Her grandmother hadn't raised her to play it safe. Zora straightened her back. She would play. The piece that had gotten her the scholarship she'd had to turn down. The one she'd practiced until her fingers bled the summer after Grandma died. She positioned her hands and took one more breath. Behind her, Thaddeus Montgomery leaned forward in his chair, champagne glass in hand, waiting for the joke to begin. Zora's fingers touched the keys, the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne Op. No. Two floated into the air. Soft, delicate, like raindrops on a window. Then her left hand joined in with the melody. And suddenly, the dining room disappeared. She was 10 years old again, sitting beside Grandma Ruby on the worn bench of their second-hand upright piano. The piano that had been squeezed into the corner of their small living room next to the window where the afternoon light made patterns on the wall. Feel the music. Don't just play it, Grandma Ruby would say. Each note tells a piece of the story. Grandma Ruby had been something special in her day. A jazz pianist who had played in clubs all over the city before marriage, and children changed her path. She had hands that seemed to float over the keys, making magic with every touch. "You've got the gift too," she'd tell Zora. "Maybe even stronger than mine." By 12, Zora was playing pieces that high school students struggled with. By 14, she was winning local competitions. The judges always looked surprised when she walked onto the stage, a thin black girl, in a homemade dress from the east side of town where music programs had been cut years ago. But then, Grandma Ruby got sick. Cancer, moving faster than anyone expected. "Keep playing," she'd whispered from her hospital bed. "Promise me." Zora had promised, But promises were hard to keep when reality got in the way. After the funeral came the bills. Medical expenses insurance wouldn't cover. The mortgage payments Grandma had fallen behind on. And Elijah, only 13 then, growing too fast for his clothes and needing things for school. Zora's mother tried to hold it all together, working 2 jobs. But when the choice came between keeping the lights on or paying for piano lessons, there wasn't really a choice at all. The scholarship offer from the Music Academy had seemed like a miracle. Full tuition. A chance to study with real masters. But it didn't cover living expenses, and someone needed to be home for Elijah after school. So the piano gathered dust. And eventually, they'd sold it to pay for the roof repair after the big storm. Now, here at the Riverstone, Zora's fingers remembered everything her mind had tried to forget. The joy, the freedom, the way music made sense when nothing else did. Her eyes closed as the music flowed through her. She didn't need to see the keys. They were part of her, an extension of her hands, her heart. Across the room, Thaddeus Montgomery's smug smile began to fade. He'd expected fumbling, maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, played with 2 fingers. Not this. Not music that made conversation stop mid-sentence. Not the kind of playing that belonged in concert halls. Thaddeus shifted in his seat. He took a sip of his wine to hide his surprise. He'd grown up with pianos. 3 of them, actually. The grand in the main house living room, the upright in the den, and the electric keyboard in his bedroom. The best teachers money could buy had tried to drill music into him. A Montgomery man knows culture, his father would say. Music, art, literature, these separate us from common people. Thaddeus had hated every minute of those lessons. His teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, would rap his knuckles with a ruler when he missed notes. He'd practiced only enough to avoid his father's disappointment. When he turned 16, he'd finally convinced his father to let him stop. Focus on business, he'd argued. That's where I can really make the Montgomery name proud. His father had agreed, but something had changed between them, as if Thaddeus had failed some test without knowing it. Now, watching the Waitress play, Thaddeus felt an uncomfortable twinge. Not just embarrassment that his joke had backfired. Something deeper. A sense of waste, of paths not taken. The other diners had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had paused, peering through the service doors to listen. Kevin, the manager, stood frozen by the bar, a towel still in his hand. One of Thaddeus's business partners, Martin, leaned over to whisper, "Did you know she could play like this?" Thaddeus shook his head, not trusting his voice. At the piano, Zora was lost in the music. Each measure carried her further from the dining room, away from the stairs, and the bills, and the exhaustion. For these few minutes, she was just music, pure, perfect, free. She played the piece all the way through, adding her own subtle flourishes where Grandma Ruby had taught her the music could breathe. When the final notes faded, she kept her hands on the keys for a moment, not wanting to break the spell. Then she heard it. Applause. Starting at one table, then another, until the whole dining room was clapping. Someone whistled from the back. Zora opened her eyes, suddenly remembering where she was. Her cheeks flushed as she stood, giving a small, awkward bow. She turned to face Thaddeus's table, not sure what to expect. Thaddeus wasn't clapping. He sat, perfectly still, his expression unreadable. The $50 bill still lay on the table where he'd set it down. It looked small now, almost insulting. One of his friends, The young one who hadn't laughed before was on his feet, applauding. Loudly! The others joined in after a moment, looking uncertainly at Thaddeus. Zora walked back to their table, her legs shaky. "Will there be anything else, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Before Thaddeus could answer, a man in an impeccable suit approached the table. Dominic Pierce, the owner of the Riverstone. Zora had only seen him from a distance before. "That was extraordinary," he said, looking directly at Zora. "Where did you study?" "I didn't, sir. Not formally. My grandmother taught me." "Your grandmother must have been remarkable." "She was, sir." Dominic turned to Thaddeus. "You never mentioned you were bringing in entertainment, Thad. Usually we coordinate these things." There was a hint of rebuke in his tone. Zora saw something flash across Thaddeus's face. Was it embarrassment? "It was spontaneous," Thaddeus said. "Well, it was a pleasant surprise." Dominic turned back to Zora. "When you have a moment, I'd like to speak with you in my office." "Yes, sir," she said, her mind racing. Was she in trouble? The club had strict rules about staff interactions with members. "I'll send someone to cover your tables," Dominic added, then nodded to the men. "Gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your evening." As he walked away, Zora reached for the wine bottle she'd set down earlier. "I'll bring your dessert course shortly," she said, trying to return to normal. But normal had shifted. The men were looking at her differently now, all except Thaddeus. He was looking past her, at the piano she'd just left. His victory dinner suddenly felt hollow, the deal they were celebrating less significant than it had an hour ago. "Keep the 50, he said abruptly, pushing the bill toward her. "You earned it." Their eyes met for a moment. In his, Zora saw something unexpected. Not just surprise or embarrassment, something that looked almost like regret. She took the money and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Thank you, sir." As she walked away, Thaddeus watched her go, then turned to stare at his half-empty wine glass. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about Mrs. Abernathy and those long-ago piano lessons, about roads not taken, about what his father had tried to teach him about culture and worth, about music that could stop a room and make time stand still. "You never said the waitress was a concert pianist," Martin said, breaking into Thaddeus's thoughts. "I didn't know," Thaddeus replied, still watching the direction Zora had gone. "Well, it made for better entertainment than those boring jazz trios they usually have," said Robert, another partner. "Maybe you should request her again next time." Thaddeus frowned. "She's not a trained monkey." The table went quiet. Thaddeus rarely contradicted Robert, who was the second-largest investor in their new development project. "Just making conversation," Robert said, raising his eyebrows. "No need to get defensive about the help." Thaddeus forced a smile. "Let's get back to celebrating. The Phillips contract is worth a toast." He raised his glass, and the moment passed. But the notes of Chopin still seemed to linger in the air around him. Dominic Pierce's office was nothing like the ornate dining room. No crystal chandeliers or velvet drapes, just clean lines, modern furniture, and large windows overlooking the city lights. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Zora perched on the edge, hands folded in her lap. Her heart was still racing from the performance, from the applause, from the rush of playing again after so long. "How long have you worked at Riverstone?" Dominic asked. 6 months, sir." "And in that time, you never mentioned you play like that?" Zora shifted uncomfortably. "It didn't seem relevant to serving tables." Dominic smiled. "No, I suppose not." He leaned forward. "Let me be direct. We hire a pianist for Friday and Saturday evenings. 3 hours, 7 to 10. Marcus, our regular, is moving to Chicago next month. The position pays $200 a night. Plus, you'd share in the evening's tip pool. Zora's breath caught. $200. For playing the piano. For doing what she loved instead of carrying plates and dodging wandering hands. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Dominic replied. You're clearly overqualified to be serving meals. And I'm not being charitable. You saw how the room responded. You'd be good for business. $600 a month, just for weekend evenings. Almost as much as she made in 2 weeks of waiting tables. She could cut back on her doubles. Have time to help Elijah with his college applications. Maybe even take a class herself at the community college. But then she remembered Thaddeus's smug face. The humiliation of being forced to perform. The way he dangled that $50 bill like she was begging on a street corner. Can I think about it? She asked. Dominic looked surprised. Of course. The position won't be open for 3 weeks. But don't think too long. I'll have to advertise if you're not interested. I understand. Thank you for the opportunity. As she stood to leave, Dominic added, That was Chopin, wasn't it? Nocturne in E-flat major? Yes, sir. My mother played that piece. Never quite like you did, though. His eyes were kind. Talent, like yours, is rare, Ms. Willis. It shouldn't be hidden. Back in the dining room, Zora moved on autopilot. Take orders, deliver food, refill drinks, smile. But everything felt different. People looked at her differently. A woman at table 12 asked if she was the pianist everyone was talking about. A man from the bar requested a song, as if she were there to take musical requests. Thaddeus's table had moved on to brandy and cigars, the volume of their conversation rising with each round. They barely noticed when she cleared their dessert, plates, all except Thaddeus, whose eyes followed her around the room. When it was time to deliver their check, Zora approached with caution, but the men were deep in conversation about golf handicaps, and only Thaddeus looked up when she set the leather folder on the table. No rush, she said automatically. As she turned to go, Thaddeus spoke. Miss Willis, she paused. Yes, sir? That piece. The one you played. What was it? Chopin's Nocturne Op. 9, number 2. He nodded slowly. It was unexpected. Was that an apology? If so, it was a poor one. Zora just nodded and walked away. At the end of her shift, she counted her tips. $240, nearly double her usual. Word had spread about her performance, and people had tipped accordingly, including Thaddeus's $50, which she'd almost left on the table out of pride. But pride didn't pay Elijah's tuition. As she waited for the bus, she looked up at the night sky. Only a few stars were visible through the city lights. Grandma Ruby used to say that music was like stars. It had always existed, just waiting for someone to discover it. You don't create music, she told Zora. You just find what's already there. The bus arrived, wheezing to a stop. Zora took a seat near the back, leaning her head against the cool window. Her fingers tapped silently against her thigh, playing the Chopin piece again in her mind. For those few minutes at the piano, she'd felt alive in a way she'd almost forgotten. The memory of Thaddeus's challenge still stung, but the music had been worth it. Across town, in his penthouse apartment, Thaddeus couldn't sleep. He'd opened a bottle of scotch when he got home, something he rarely did on weeknights. Business required a clear head in the mornings. But tonight, his thoughts kept returning to the Riverstone, to the waitress at the piano, to music that had made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. He walked to his laptop and typed Chopin Nocturne Op. 9 No. 2 into the search bar. Dozens of recordings appeared. He clicked on one by a famous pianist. It was the same piece, technically perfect. But something was missing. The life, the breath, the waitress, Zora, had given it. He tried another recording. And another. None of them moved him the way her playing had. Thaddeus closed the laptop and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city. Somewhere out there, she was probably in some small apartment, those talented hands washing dishes or folding laundry. It bothered him, though he couldn't say why. He'd built his empire by recognizing opportunities, by spotting talent and either acquiring it or crushing it. But this was different. He didn't have a word for what this was. His phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Contract signing. Tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late like last time. Thaddeus put his phone away without responding. For the first time in years, business wasn't at the forefront of his mind. Instead, he found himself wondering what other pieces Zora Willis could play, and why she was serving food instead of playing in concert halls. He made a decision then, standing in the dark of his apartment. He would go back to the Riverstone tomorrow. Not for business, not for networking, just to hear her play again. Morning came too quickly for Zora. The alarm buzzed at 6:30, and she reached to silence it before it woke Elijah in the next room. Their apartment walls were thin, and he'd been up late studying for a biology exam. Her fingers were stiff as she made coffee. Playing after so long had awakened muscles she'd forgotten she had. She flexed her hands, stretching each finger carefully. Chadtu, coffee machine sputtered and coughed before producing a stream of dark liquid. Like the refrigerator and the bathroom sink, it worked just well enough that they couldn't justify replacing it. Zora poured a cup and sat at their small kitchen table. Last night's tips were still in her purse. She counted them again, just to be sure. $290 total, including Thaddeus Montgomery's $50. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kevin, her manager. Boss wants to talk to you. Call when you can. Dominic Pierce. The piano job. $200 a night. Just to play. Just to do the thing she'd once loved more than anything. Elijah shuffled into the kitchen, hair sticking up in all directions. At 19, he was still, growing into his lanky frame, all elbows and knees. There's coffee, she said. He grunted in response, reaching for a mug. That was about all she'd get from him before 8 a.m. I got offered a job last night, she said as he sat across from her, playing piano at Riverstone on weekends. That got his attention. For real? That fancy club where you work? Yeah. 3 hours on Friday and Saturday nights. $200 each night, plus tips. Elijah's eyes widened. That's amazing, Z. You'd be making more than you do serving tables. I know. So you said yes, right? Zora stared into her coffee. I said I'd think about it. What's there to think about? You love playing. And no more smelly food or creepy guys asking for your number. She hadn't told him about Thaddeus Montgomery. About being forced to play, like some kind of circus act. How could she explain that this job offer, as good as it was, had roots in her humiliation? It's complicated, she said. Elijah rolled his eyes. You always say that when you don't want to explain. Because it usually is complicated. Look, is this about Grandma's piano? Because you know she'd want... Don't. Zora's voice was sharper than she intended. Don't tell me what she'd want. Elijah raised his hands in surrender. Fine. But at least call the guy back. Hear what he has to say. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Hello? She answered. Ms. Willis? This is Dominic Pierce from Riverstone." Zora shot a look at Elijah, who raised his eyebrows and mouthed, "Take it." "Yes, Mr. Pierce. I was just about to call you." "Excellent. I wanted to follow up on our conversation. Have you had a chance to consider my offer?" Zora took a deep breath. "I have, but I'm still not sure. What if I sweeten the deal? We could start you at $250 a night, with a review after the first month. $50 more per night. That was groceries for a week." "That's very generous," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not generosity, Ms. Willis. Good business. Your playing last night had people talking. That's valuable to Riverstone." Elijah was making exaggerated nodding motions across the table. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. "Marcus leaves in 3 weeks. You could shadow him the weekend before, get comfortable with the setup. We'd provide sheet music, though you're welcome to bring your own as well." It was all happening so fast. Just yesterday, playing piano had been a memory, something she'd set aside out of necessity. Now it was being handed back to her like a gift. But gifts could be taken away just as easily. "Can I have until tomorrow to decide?" she asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, but I should tell you, I've had 3 calls this morning asking about the waitress who played Chopin. Whatever you decide about the job, you made quite an impression." After they hung up, Elijah looked at her like she was crazy. "Why didn't you just say yes?" "Because I need to think it through," she said, standing to rinse her mug. "I'd still need my regular shifts. The piano gig alone wouldn't cover our bills. So, do both for a while. See how it goes." It made sense. So why was she hesitating? Was it pride, fear, or something deeper? The worry that if she let music back into her life, losing it a second time would break her completely? "I've got class," Elijah said, glancing at the clock. "But seriously, Z, call him back. Say yes." He grabbed his backpack and headed for the door, then stopped. "Oh, and I forgot to tell you yesterday. I got an A on that paper. The one you stayed up helping me with." He grinned, and for a moment, Zora saw the gap-toothed 8-year-old he'd once been. The little boy who'd curl up beside the piano while she practiced, falling asleep to Chopin and Bach. "That's great, E. Really great." After he left, Zora opened her laptop. She had 2 hours before her shift at Riverstone. 2 hours to make a decision that suddenly felt bigger than just a job. She searched for Chopin Nocturne Opus 9 No. 2 and clicked on a video. The music filled their small apartment, beautiful but somehow flat, like hearing an echo instead of the real thing. She closed her eyes, letting her fingers move silently in her lap, playing along with the recording. The muscle memory was still there, waiting. Across town, Thaddeus Montgomery walked into a conference room 15 minutes late. He'd overslept for the first time in years. "Nice of you to join us," Robert said, not bothering to hide his annoyance. "Traffic," Thaddeus lied, taking his seat at the head of the table. The truth was, he'd been up half the night listening to Chopin recordings and thinking about a waitress with extraordinary hands. When he'd finally fallen asleep, he'd dreamt of music. Not the stuffy classical pieces Mrs. Abernathy had forced him to learn, but something alive and breathing. The meeting dragged on. Contracts, projections, zoning variances, things that usually held his complete attention now seemed trivial compared to the question that kept circling in his mind. Why was a woman who played piano like that serving drinks at Riverstone? As soon as the meeting ended, he called Dominic. "Pierce." "Thaddeus," Dominic answered. "Twice in 2 days. To what do I owe the pleasure?" That waitress from last night. The one who played. Have you offered her a job yet? As a matter of fact, I have. How did you know? Lucky guess, Thaddeus said. Did she take it? She's considering it. Why the interest? Planning another impromptu recital? Thaddeus ignored the jab. No, just curious. She's talented. Yes, she is. Anything else I can help you with? I need a table for one tonight. By the piano, if possible. There was a pause. She won't be playing tonight, Thad. That was a one-time thing you orchestrated. I know. The table is just for dinner. Another pause. 7 o'clock work for you? Perfect. Thaddeus hung up and turned to find Robert still in the conference room, watching him with curious eyes. Hot date at Riverstone? Robert asked. That waitress made quite an impression. Just dinner, Thaddeus replied, gathering his papers. And she's a pianist, not a waitress. She was carrying our plates last night. People can be more than one thing, Robert. Robert raised his eyebrows. Since when do you care about the hidden talents of service staff? Thaddeus didn't answer. He wasn't sure himself why he cared so much. Only that something about Zora Willis and her music had gotten under his skin. Don't forget we have the zoning meeting tomorrow, Robert called after him as he left. 9 a.m. sharp. Try to be on time for once. Zora's shift at Riverstone was unusually busy for a Thursday. Word had spread about her performance, and several regular customers requested her section specifically. Some asked if she would be playing again. Others just watched her with new interest, as if trying to reconcile the woman who refilled their water glasses with the one who had commanded the piano. Kevin pulled her aside during a lull. What did you say to Dominic about the piano job? That, I'd think about it. He shook his head. You'd be crazy not to take it. Do you know how many people would kill for that gig? I know. It's just what? Better money, better hours, doing something you're obviously amazing at. He lowered his voice. Plus, no more dealing with jerks like Montgomery. Zora's head snapped up. What about Montgomery? He's coming in tonight. Requested a table by the piano. Alone. A chill ran down her spine. Why? Kevin shrugged. No idea. But Dominic gave him the reservation, so be ready. Zora felt sick. Was Thaddeus coming back to mock her again? To dangle another 50 in front of her? Can someone else take his table? Sorry, Z. He asked for you specifically. The rest of her shift crawled by as she waited for 7 o'clock. Each time the door opened, she tensed, expecting to see Thaddeus's tall figure and cold eyes. But 7 o'clock came and went, and he didn't appear. 7:30. 8. By 8:30, Zora began to relax. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe it had all been some weird power play. She was clearing a table when her phone vibrated. A text from Elijah. Running late. Community center piano broke down. Kids devastated. Can you come? Zora checked the time. 9:15. Her shift ended at 10. Kevin, she called, showing him the text. Can I go early? Family emergency. Kevin glanced around the nearly empty dining room. Fine. Just finish your tables first. 20 minutes later, Zora was on the bus heading toward the east. Side Community Center. She volunteered there twice a week, teaching basic piano to children whose schools had cut music programs years ago. Most had never touched a piano before meeting her. The community center was housed in an old church building, its brick facade crumbling in places. Inside, the walls were bright with children's artwork, and the floors were clean despite their worn appearance. Elijah met her at the door. Thanks for coming. The kids were really upset. What happened to the piano? 2 keys completely stopped working. And something's wrong with the pedal. Mr. Davis says they can't afford to fix it right now. Zora followed him to the music room where 6 children aged 8 to 12 sat around a battered upright piano. Their faces lit up when they saw her. "Miss Zora," a little girl named Pia called. "The piano's sick." Zora smiled, setting down her purse. "Let me take a look." She sat at the piano, pressing each key gently. The F and G above middle C made no sound at all. The sustain pedal was completely loose. "It's definitely sick," she agreed. "But maybe we can still have our lesson. We'll just work around the broken keys." She began to play a simple tune, avoiding the dead notes. The children gathered closer, watching her hands. "See? We can still make music, even when things aren't perfect." For the next half hour, Zora worked with each child individually, teaching them to adapt their simple pieces to the piano's limitations. It was a good lesson, she realized. Life rarely gave you perfect instruments to work with. She was helping Pia with "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" when she felt it, that prickle on the back of her neck that meant someone was watching. She turned toward the door. Thaddeus Montgomery stood in the doorway, his tall frame incongruous against the colorful children's artwork. He wore the same expensive suit from earlier, but his tie was loosened, and he looked almost as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, standing quickly, "what are you doing here?" The children turned to stare at the stranger. "I came to Riverstone, but you'd left," he said. "Your manager mentioned something about a community center and a broken piano. So you followed me?" Zora felt her defenses rise. "Why?" Before Thaddeus could answer, Pia tugged at Zora's sleeve. "Miss Zora, who's that man?" "Just someone I know from work," Zora said, not taking her eyes off Thaddeus. "We're almost done with our lesson." Thaddeus stepped into the room, looking at the old piano with its chipped keys and scratched wood. "This is where you teach?" "Yes," Zora said stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, Miss Zora, I can't make it sound right." Another child interrupted, a boy named Deshawn. "Listen." He played a halting melody, his small fingers pressing carefully on the keys. When he reached the broken notes, the music faltered. "Try skipping those notes," Zora suggested, moving to help him. "Like this," she demonstrated, and the E boy tried again. Better, but still frustrated. "It's hard," he said, his face falling. "I know," Zora said gently, "but sometimes we have to work with what we have." Thaddeus watched the exchange silently. Something in his expression had changed. The cold arrogance softened by something like curiosity. "How long have you been teaching here?" he asked, when the boy moved aside. 2 years, Zora said. "These kids don't have music programs at their schools." Thaddeus looked at the children, then back at Zora. "And they all want to learn piano?" "There's a waiting list," Elijah said from the corner, where he'd been observing. 20 kids, at least." Thaddeus nodded slowly. He approached the piano, examining it with a critical eye. "This instrument is barely functional." "We're aware," Zora said coldly. "Not everyone can afford Steinways." The children were watching, the exchange with wide eyes. Zora realized she needed to end this strange confrontation. "Our time is up for today," she announced. "Remember to practice your finger exercises, even if you don't have a piano at home. You can use a tabletop." As the children gathered their things, Thaddeus stepped back, looking uncomfortable for the first time since Zora had met him. He clearly didn't belong here, among the worn furniture and hopeful faces. "Mr. Montgomery was just leaving," Zora told the children as they filed out. When they were gone, she turned to face him fully. "Why did you follow me here?" Thaddeus straightened, his tie. "I wanted to ask about the piano job at Riverstone. Pierce said he offered it to you. And that's your business, because I recommended you." Zora laughed incredulously. "You forced me to play to humiliate me. Now you're taking credit for the job offer? That's not— What do you want, Mr. Montgomery? Another performance? More entertainment for your friends?" Elijah stepped forward. "Z, maybe you should hear, him out. Stay out of this, E." "No," Elijah said firmly. "This is the guy from last night, right? The one who made you play?" Thaddeus looked between them. "I'm sorry if it came across that way. It wasn't my intention to humiliate you." "What was your intention then?" Zora demanded. For once, Thaddeus Montgomery seemed at a loss for words. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But hearing you play, it was unexpected." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension thick between them. Finally, Zora sighed. "Look, I appreciate that you recommended me for the job, but I don't need your help or your approval. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to lock up." Thaddeus nodded once, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If you change your mind about the job, call me. I might have a proposal that would interest you." Zora didn't take the card. "What kind of proposal?" "One that involves more than just playing at Riverstone." He set the card on top of the piano. "Think about it." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The children are lucky to have you as a teacher, even with a broken piano." And then he was gone, leaving Zora staring after him, the business card lying untouched on the scarred wood of the piano. "What was that about?" Elijah asked. Zora shook her head. "I have no idea." But something had shifted. In the coldness of Thaddeus Montgomery's eyes, she had glimpsed something unexpected, something almost like respect. Zora didn't touch the business card that night. She left it on the piano where Thaddeus had placed it, as if it might burn her fingers. On the bus ride home, Elijah kept glancing at her, clearly bursting with questions. "Just say whatever you're thinking," she said finally. "That guy is loaded," Elijah said, "and he tracked you down at the community center after hours." "Your point?" "My point is that rich people don't usually go that far unless they want something." Zora sighed. "He probably just feels guilty. Or maybe this is some weird power trip for him. Or maybe he was impressed by your playing and wants to help." "Since when are you so trusting of strange rich men?" Zora asked, raising an eyebrow. Elijah shrugged. "Since one might be able to fix the center's piano, or get us a new one." The thought had crossed Zora's mind too, but she pushed it away. Taking anything from Thaddeus Montgomery would feel like admitting he'd been right to humiliate her. Like she needed his charity. "We'll find another way to fix the piano," she said. But by the next morning, practical considerations had begun to outweigh pride. The children at the center deserved a working instrument. If Thaddeus was offering to help them, could she really refuse? When Elijah left for class, Zora returned to the community center. The business card was still there, glossy white against the scarred wood. She picked it up. Thaddeus Montgomery, CEO, Montgomery Development Group. Below that, a phone number, an email address. Nothing fancy or pretentious, just simple black text on white cardstock. Before she could change her mind, she pulled out her phone and dialed. He answered on the second ring. "Montgomery. This is Zora Willis." A pause. "Ms. Willis, I'm glad you called." "I haven't agreed to anything," she said quickly. "I just want to hear this proposal of yours." "Of course. Are you free for lunch today? We could meet at Carlisle's at noon. Carlisle's was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. The kind of place where Zora would normally only go as a server, not a guest. I'd prefer somewhere less exclusive, she said. Another pause. Name the place. She suggested a small cafe near the community center. It wasn't fancy, but the food was good, and she wouldn't feel completely out of place. Noon works for me, she said. I'll see you then. The cafe was busy with the lunch rush when Zora arrived. She'd changed into her nicest jeans and a simple blue blouse, not trying to impress, but not wanting to feel completely outclassed either. Thaddeus was already there, looking strangely out of place in his tailored suit. He'd taken a corner table and had a cup of coffee in front of him. He stood when he saw her, a gesture from another era. Ms. Willis, Mr. Montgomery. They sat and eat out, an awkward silence falling between them. A waitress came to take their orders, sandwich for Zora, soup for Thaddeus. So, Zora said when they were alone again, your proposal? Thaddeus folded his hands on the table. I'd like to fund a music program at the community center. Whatever Zora had been expecting, it wasn't this. Why? I saw those children yesterday. How engaged they were, despite the broken piano. How you taught them to work around the limitations instead of giving up. He paused. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Which is that music isn't just for people who can afford Steinways. Zora studied his face, looking for signs of condescension or false charity. She found none. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. A new piano for starters, and funding for a proper program, sheet music, materials, maybe even scholarships for the most promising students. And what do you want in return? Thaddeus looked surprised. Nothing. Everyone wants something, Mr. Montgomery. He sat back, a faint smile on his lips. You're right, of course. But what I want isn't what you think. Enlighten me. The waitress returned with their food, pausing their conversation. When she left, Thaddeus leaned forward. When I was 8, my mother hired a piano teacher for me. Mrs. Abernathy. A shadow crossed his face. 3 times a week, she'd come to our house and drill Bach and Mozart into me. I hated every minute of it. Then why continue? My father insisted. He said music was part of being cultured, and being cultured was part of being a Montgomery. Thaddeus stirred his soup absently. But I never felt the music. Not like those children did yesterday. Not like you do when you play. Zora took a bite of her sandwich, giving herself time to think. So, this is about what? Reliving your childhood through these kids? Thaddeus shook his head. It's about not wasting talent. Those children have something real, something that shouldn't be lost because of a broken piano or budget cuts. Their eyes met across the table and Zora saw it again, that unexpected sincerity that didn't match the cold businessman she'd first met. Why me? She asked. You could donate to any music program in the city, ones with professional teachers and proper facilities, because you made Chopin sound like something new. He said it simply, like stating a fact. Because you taught those kids to make music even when the instrument was broken. That's rare. Zora was silent for a long moment. If I agree to this, I'd need complete control over the program. No interference. Of course. And no publicity stunts. These children aren't props for your corporate image. Thaddeus nodded. Agreed. Why should I trust you? She asked bluntly. You shouldn't, he replied. Not yet, but I hope you'll give me a chance to earn that trust. Something in his tone made Zora look at him more closely. There was vulnerability there, hidden beneath the expensive suit and confident manner. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But I need to talk to the center director first." "Understood." Thaddeus reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is what I'm proposing, in writing. Take it to your director." Zora took the owed envelope and slipped it into her bag without opening it. "Thank you for lunch, Mr. Montgomery." "Thaddeus, please." She hesitated, then nodded. Zora. Mr. Davis, the community center director, could hardly believe the proposal. A fully funded music program, new instruments, materials, and scholarships, Zora added, watching his face. "What's the catch?" he asked, suspicious after years of dealing with broken promises and budget cuts. "No catch. He just wants to help." Mr. Davis adjusted his glasses, reading the proposal again. "Says here he wants to name it after someone. Ruby Willis Music Program?" He looked up. "Relative of yours?" Zora's breath caught. "My grandmother." She hadn't noticed that detail when she'd finally read the proposal. Ruby Willis. The woman who had taught her to love music, to feel it in her bones. "You trust this guy?" Mr. Davis asked. "Not entirely," Zora admitted. "But I think he's sincere about this." "Well, we'd be fools to turn it down," he sighed. "But I'll have our lawyer look it over first, just to be safe." 3 days later, Zora sat at a table in Riverstone Club, across from Dominic Pierce and Thaddeus Montgomery. On the table between them lay 2 contracts, one for the weekend pianist position, one for the community center program. "Both offers stand independently," Thaddeus said. "You can accept one, both, or neither." Zora looked between the 2 men. "And if I say no to the community center program?" "The offer remains open to the center, with no strings attached," Thaddeus replied. "Though I'd prefer you be involved." Dominic pushed the Riverstone contract toward her. "For what it's worth, I hope you'll take this one. We need someone with your talent." Zora's pen hovered over the paper. 2 doors opening simultaneously. 2 paths forward that, just a week ago, had seemed impossible. All because a rich man had tried to humiliate her, and she'd turned the tables by simply being herself. "I'll take both," she said, signing the Riverstone contract first, then the program agreement. "Excellent," Dominic said, standing. "I'll get these copied for you." When he'd left, Zora turned to Thaddeus. "I still don't fully understand why you're doing this." Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. "Let's just say I'm trying to correct a mistake." "Forcing me to play?" "No." His eyes met hers. "Forgetting that music matters." As they sat in silence, Elijah burst through the door, his face tense. "Zora, we need to talk, now." "What's wrong?" He glanced at Thaddeus, then back to her. "I've been doing some research on Montgomery development. There's something you need to know before you sign anything." Zora felt a chill run down her spine. "I already signed." Elijah's face fell. "Then we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" Thaddeus asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Elijah pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "The kind where your company is buying up property all around. The East Side, including the block where the community center stands." Zora's stomach dropped. "What?" "I've been following real estate transactions in that area for a school project," Elijah explained. "Montgomery Development has been using shell companies to purchase properties. They've bought 6 buildings on that block already." Thaddeus's face had gone completely blank. "Where did you get this information?" "Public records. I'm studying urban development. It's not exactly hidden if you know where to look." Elijah turned to Zora. They're planning to demolish the whole area for a new luxury complex. Zora looked at Thaddeus, searching his face for confirmation. Is this true? I'd need to look into it, Thaddeus said carefully. Montgomery Development is a large company with many ongoing projects. That's not a denial, Zora pointed out. It's also not a confirmation. I'm not personally involved in every acquisition. Zora laughed bitterly. So you had no idea your company was buying property around the same community center you suddenly want to fund? Dominic returned with the contracts, stopping short when he sensed the tension. Is everything all right? No, Zora said, standing. It's not. She grabbed both contracts. I need to reconsider these. Zora, wait, Thaddeus said, rising as well. Let me explain. I think Elijah just did that for you. She turned to Dominic. I'm sorry, but I can't accept the position right now. Before either man could respond, Zora walked out, Elijah following close behind. I'm sorry, he said when they reached the street. I should have told you sooner, but I only connected the dots this morning. It's not your fault, she said, her voice tight. I should have known better than to trust him. As they waited for the bus, Zora's phone buzzed with a text from Thaddeus. It's not what you think. Please let me explain. She turned off her phone. 2 weeks passed. Zora continued her regular shifts at Riverstone, but Thaddeus never returned to the club. The piano position went to someone else, though Dominic told her the offer remained open if she changed her mind. The community center received a new piano anyway, delivered anonymously, though everyone knew who had sent it. Mr. Davis had accepted it gratefully. We can't afford to turn it down, no matter where it came from, he'd said. Zora had to admit it made a difference. The children's lessons improved dramatically with a properly functioning instrument. But the knowledge that it might all be temporary, that the entire center might soon be demolished for luxury condos, hung over her like a cloud. Then came the invitation, hand-delivered to her apartment by a courier. Heavy cream paper with embossed lettering. The Montgomery Foundation cordially invites you to a fundraising gala for the Ruby Willis music program. Friday, 7 p.m., Riverstone Club. Zora's first instinct was to tear it up, but Elijah, looking over her shoulder, stopped her. You should go, he said. Why would I do that? Because you need to know what he's really planning, and because they're using Grandma Ruby's name. He was right about that. Using her grandmother's name for what might be nothing more than a PR stunt before demolishing the center. That was a line Zora couldn't let Thaddeus cross. Fine, she said. I'll go. The gala was 3 days away. Zora had nothing suitable to wear to such an event. She called in a favor from Mira, a friend who worked at a high-end boutique, who let her borrow a simple black dress that probably cost more than a month's rent. You're going to knock them dead, Mira assured her after the final fitting. Just remember, chin up, shoulders back, and don't let them see you sweat. On Friday evening, Zora stood outside Riverstone, gathering her courage. Through the windows, she could see the main dining room had been transformed. Round tables draped in white linen. Floral arrangements. A small stage erected near the grand piano. You came, said a voice behind her. She turned to find Thaddeus, impeccable in a black. Tuxedo. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes she hadn't noticed before. I came for Grandma Ruby, she said coldly. Not for you, he nodded, accepting this. Will you at least let me explain inside, before you make any final judgments? You've had 2 weeks to explain. You have my number. And would you have answered if I'd called? She didn't respond, which was answer enough. Thaddeus held the door open. Please, After tonight, if you still want nothing to do with me or the program, I'll respect that." Zora walked past him into the club, her borrowed heels clicking on the marble floor. The room was already half full with people in expensive clothes, drinking champagne and examining the silent auction items displayed along one wall. "There are some people I'd like you to meet," Thaddeus said, guiding her toward a group near the piano. Before they could reach them, Elijah appeared at her side, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed suit. "Can I talk to you?" he asked urgently. "Alone?" "I'll give you a moment," Thaddeus said, stepping away. Elijah pulled Zora to a quiet corner. "I found something else." He showed her his phone. "These are the plans for the development. They're going to keep the community center building as the historic centerpiece of the new complex." "What does that mean?" "It means they're not demolishing it. They're renovating it as a cultural hub for the neighborhood, with the Ruby Willis music program as its main feature." Zora frowned. "So it was always going to stay? The music program wasn't just for show?" "Looks that way. The rest of the block is being developed, but the center stays." Zora looked across the room at Thaddeus, who was speaking with an older couple but glancing her way. Had she misjudged him? "That still doesn't explain why he didn't tell me about the development," she said. "Maybe he was going to," Elijah suggested, "before I blurted it out." Before Zora could respond, Dominic Pierce appeared at the small podium on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first annual Ruby Willis Music Program fundraiser. We're honored to host this event at Riverstone." He gestured to Thaddeus. "I'd like to invite Thaddeus Montgomery to say a few words about this important initiative." Polite applause followed Thaddeus to the stage. He adjusted the microphone, then looked out at the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight. The Ruby Willis music program is very close to my heart, though I only learned of Ruby Willis's legacy recently." His eyes found Zora in the crowd. She was a talented jazz pianist who devoted her life to sharing music with others, particularly her granddaughter, Zora. Zora felt the weight of eyes turning toward her. She stood straighter, chin up as Mira had instructed. "Tonight," Thaddeus continued, "we have a special treat. Zora Willis has agreed to perform for us." Zora's head snapped. Up! She had agreed to no such thing. Thaddeus seemed to read her surprise. "At least, I hope she will." He extended his hand toward her. "Zora, would you honor us with a piece?" The room erupted in enthusiastic applause. Zora stood frozen, anger and confusion warring inside her. She'd been manipulated, again, into performing at his request. But this time was different. This time, she had a choice. She could refuse, walk out, end this strange connection between them once and for all. Or she could play, not for Thaddeus, but for Grandma Ruby. For the children at the center who deserved a chance she'd never had. Slowly, deliberately, Zora walked to the piano. The applause grew louder, then faded as she sat on the bench. Thaddeus stepped down from the podium, a satisfied smile on his face. "I had planned to play Debussy tonight," Zora said into the microphone beside the piano, "but I've decided on something else. Something more honest." She positioned her hands over the keys and began to play. Not the classical piece she'd prepared, but something raw and improvised. Something that expressed everything she'd been feeling, the anger, the confusion, the cautious hope, the lingering distrust. It started slow and contemplative, like questions without answers. Then it built, growing more complex and dissonant, chords clashing like arguments. Finally, it resolved into something neither happy nor sad, but searching, unfinished. When she finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap, slowly at first, Then others joined in. Not the polite, obligatory applause of wealthy donors, but something more genuine, something that acknowledged they'd witnessed not just music, but truth. Zora stood and gave a small bow. As she turned to leave the stage, her eyes met Thaddeus's. His expression was unreadable, part admiration, part confusion. He hadn't expected this. Good, she thought. Neither had she. As the applause continued, Zora walked straight toward him. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Now." Thaddeus nodded, leading her toward a side door and into the quiet hallway beyond. When they were alone, Zora turned to face him. "Why didn't you tell me about the development plans?" "I was going to," he said. "That day, when you signed the contracts. But then your brother arrived, and everything happened so quickly. And you couldn't call or text in the 2 weeks since." Thaddeus ran a hand through his hair, a surprisingly human gesture from someone usually so composed. "I wanted to explain in person, and I thought you might be more receptive after seeing that the program was real, so you tricked me into coming tonight. I invited you. There's a difference. And putting me on the spot to perform? Was that part of your plan too? I thought you'd want to play for your grandmother's program." Zora laughed bitterly. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about whether I want to play. It's about choices. My choices, not yours." Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. "You're right," he said finally. "I apologize." The simple admission caught Zora off guard. She'd expected defensiveness, justifications, not a straightforward apology. Before she could respond, the door behind them opened. Elijah stood there, his face tense. "Z, I just overheard something. They're not just renovating the center. They're taking it over completely. The current programs will be shut down, including the after-school care. It'll be music only, with paid admission." Zora looked back at Thaddeus. "Is that true?" The flash of guilt in his eyes was all the confirmation she needed. "So this was all a lie?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Use my grandmother's name. Use me. All to make your development look good, while you shut down what matters most to the community?" "It's complicated," Thaddeus began. "No, it's actually very simple," Zora cut him off. "You never cared about those kids or their music. This was just business for you, a PR move." She turned to leave, Elijah at her side. "Zora, wait!" Thaddeus called after her. "Let me fix this." But she kept walking, head high, out of the hallway, and through the crowded room of donors who had no idea what the Ruby Willis music program really meant, or what was being lost in its creation. Outside, the night air was cool against Zora's flushed skin. She gulped it down, trying to steady herself. "I'm sorry, Z," Elijah said, his hand on her shoulder. "I thought maybe he was actually trying to help." "So did I," she admitted. "That's what makes it worse." They were halfway down the block when a voice called after them. "Ms. Willis, please wait." It wasn't Thaddeus. It was an older woman in an elegant gray dress, one of the guests from the fundraiser. She hurried toward them, slightly out of breath. "I'm sorry to chase after you like this," she said. "I'm Barbara Roswell. I was so moved by your performance." "Thank you," Zora said, eager to be polite but wanting to leave. "The way you played, it was Ruby all over again." Zora froze. "You knew my grandmother?" Barbara smiled. "We played together years ago, at the Blue Note and a few other clubs. Was on saxophone. Not nearly as good as she was on piano, but we made a decent team. My grandmother never mentioned it was a brief time. Before she met your grandfather, I believe. Barbara's eyes grew distant with memory. But you play just like her. Same soul in the music. Before Zora could respond, the doors of Riverstone burst open. Thaddeus emerged, scanning the street until he spotted them. "Ah, there he is," Barbara said. "My nephew never knows when to quit." "Your nephew?" Zora asked, startled. "Yes, Thaddeus is my sister's boy, stubborn as they come." Thaddeus approached, cautiously, as if expecting Zora to run. "Aunt Barbara, I see you've met Zora." "I was just telling her that she plays like Ruby," Barbara said. "You were right about that." Zora looked between them, confusion overriding her anger. "What's going on here?" "Perhaps we could go somewhere more private to talk," Barbara suggested. "There's a coffee shop around the corner that should still be open." 15 minutes later, they sat in a quiet booth. Elijah had reluctantly agreed to wait at the front of the shop, giving them space but staying close enough if Zora needed him. "My nephew has made a mess of things," Barbara said bluntly. "As usual." Thaddeus didn't argue, which surprised Zora more than anything else. "What I don't understand," Zora said, "is why all the secrecy about the development plans. Why not just be upfront from the beginning?" Thaddeus sighed. "The development was my father's project, not mine. I'm only involved because I'm part of the company. Your father? Preston Montgomery. He founded Montgomery Development 40 years ago. I took over as CEO 5 years ago, but he still chairs the board and oversees many of our major investments, including this one," Barbara added. "So you're saying you didn't know about the plans for the community center?" Zora asked skeptically. "I knew the area was being targeted for redevelopment. I didn't know the specific plans for the center until recently." Thaddeus met her eyes. "When I heard you play at Riverstone that night, it wasn't part of some master plan. It was just me being, well, an entitled jerk, if we're being honest." The admission surprised her. "But then, you followed me to the center, because I wanted to apologize properly. And then I saw you with those kids, teaching them despite that broken-down piano. And it reminded me of something my aunt had told me years ago." Barbara picked up the thread. "I told him about a young pianist I knew in the 70s, a black woman, with more talent in her little finger than most musicians have in their whole bodies. But opportunities were limited then, especially for someone like Ruby. So when I realized who you were, who your grandmother was, it felt like more than coincidence," Thaddeus said. "Like a chance to right an old wrong." "By destroying the community center?" Zora asked. "That was never my intention. But my father's plans were already in motion." Thaddeus looked down at his untouched coffee. "I thought I could change things from the inside. Preserve the music program at least. Honor your grandmother's legacy, while letting everything else at the center be gutted. I was trying to salvage what I could." Barbara reached across the table, her hand covering Zora's. "Dear, I knew your grandmother. Not as well as I would have liked, but enough to know she valued honesty above all else. So let me be honest with you now." Zora waited, holding her breath. "My brother-in-law, Preston, is not a good man. He built his fortune by taking what others valued and turning it into profit. He taught my nephew to do the same." "Aunt Barbara," Thaddeus began. "Let me finish, Thad." She turned back to Zora. "But somewhere along the way, this one developed a conscience. It gets him in trouble with his father regularly." Zora looked at Thaddeus, seeing him in a new light. "Is that true?" "We've had our disagreements," he said carefully. "What he's not telling you," Barbara continued, "is that Preston threatened to remove him as CEO last year when Thaddeus blocked a development that would have displaced hundreds of low-income residents. It was a bad investment, Thaddeus said. Purely business, Barbara snorted. Keep telling yourself that. Zora's mind was racing. So the development around the community center is going forward with or without my approval, Thaddeus finished. But the center itself, what happens to it? That might still be negotiable. If I can convince my father it's worth more preserved than gutted. He hesitated. That's where the fundraiser comes in. If we can show enough community support, financial backing, a PR move after all, Zora said. But the accusation had lost some of its sting. Partly, Thaddeus admitted, but also a genuine effort to save something important. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything between them. I should have told you all this from the beginning, Thaddeus said finally. I was afraid you wouldn't trust me, which, in retrospect, was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what happens now? Zora asked. That depends, Barbara said, on whether you're willing to give my nephew one more chance to prove he's not entirely like his father. Zora thought of the children at the center, of Mr. Davis and the other staff who relied on the programs for their livelihoods, of her grandmother, who had taught her that music could build bridges between worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. I'll need to see the full development plans, she said, and meet with your father. Thaddeus looked startled. My father isn't easy to. Those are my terms. Full transparency from now on, or I walk away and tell every donor at that fundraiser exactly what's happening. Something flickered in Thaddeus's eyes. Respect, maybe even admiration. All right, I'll arrange it. Tomorrow, Zora insisted. No more delays. Tomorrow, he agreed. As they prepared to leave, Barbara pulled a small envelope from her purse. I almost forgot. I brought this for you. I thought you might want to have it. Inside was a faded photograph, a jazz quartet on a small stage. A young black woman sat at the piano, her face alight with the joy of music. Beside her, a young Barbara on saxophone, and two men on bass and drums. That's the Blue Note, 1973, Barbara said. One of the few times we were photographed together. Zora traced her finger over her grandmother's face. Thank you for this. Ruby was special, Barbara said simply. And so are you. Outside the coffee shop, Elijah was waiting impatiently. Everything okay? I'm not sure, Zora said honestly, but I think maybe it could be. They parted ways with Thaddeus and Barbara on the sidewalk. As they walked toward the bus stop, Elijah nudged her gently. So, you're meeting his father tomorrow? The big bad developer? Apparently. Want me to come with you? Moral support? Zora smiled, grateful for her brother's unwavering presence in her life. Always. That night, Zora couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the photograph, about her grandmother's bright young face, about music that built bridges, about second chances and the possibility of redemption. She got up and opened her laptop, searching for something specific. In her bookmarks was a file she hadn't opened in years, a scan of an old, unfinished composition in her grandmother's handwriting. Unfinished Symphony, the title read. The last piece Ruby had been working on before she died. Zora stared at it, an idea forming. Sometimes the best way forward was through the past. Preston Montgomery's office occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming downtown skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, including, Zora noted, the East Side neighborhood where the community center stood. He likes to see what he owns, Thaddeus said quietly, following her gaze. They sat in a waiting area furnished with sleek leather chairs and abstract art that probably cost more than Zora's yearly salary. Elijah fidgeted beside her, uncomfortable, in his borrowed suit. "Maybe this was a mistake," he whispered. "No," Zora replied. "We need to see this through." The door to the inner office opened, and a stern-faced secretary emerged. "Mr. Montgomery will see you now." Thaddeus stood, buttoning his suit jacket. "Ready?" Zora nodded, clutching her folder of notes and the precious sheet music she'd brought. Along, Preston Montgomery was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd expected someone imposing like Thaddeus, tall and commanding. Instead, she found a slight man with thinning gray hair and sharp eyes behind designer glasses. He didn't rise when they entered. "This had better be important, Thaddeus," he said, his voice surprisingly deep for his frame. "I moved 3 meetings for this. Thank you for making the time, Father." Thaddeus's voice had changed subtly, more formal, less confident. "This is Zora Willis and her brother Elijah." Preston barely glanced at them. "The pianist from that charity thing. Barbara mentioned you. Ms. Willis has some concerns about the East Side development," Thaddeus continued. "Specifically, the community center." "The cultural hub, you mean," Preston corrected. "It's a centerpiece of the new development. I thought you'd be pleased we're keeping it." "But not the existing programs," Zora said, speaking for the first time. "Not the after-school care, or the senior activities, or the job training." Preston's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those programs can relocate. We're creating something better." "Better for whom?" Zora asked. "For everyone. A rising tide lifts all boats, Ms. Willis. Unless you can't afford a boat," Elijah muttered. Preston's gaze flicked to him, then back to Zora. "The Ruby Willis music program will be state-of-the-art. Private instruction, master classes, performances. Exactly the kind of cultural resource that neighborhood has always lacked." "And who will it serve?" Zora asked. "The children already there, or the new residents who can afford your luxury apartments?" "Anyone willing to invest in quality education. So, not the kids who come to the center now," Zora translated. "Not the ones whose schools have cut music programs and whose parents work 2 jobs to keep the lights on." A flash of irritation crossed Preston's face. "I've indulged this meeting as a courtesy to my son and sister-in-law. But Montgomery Development doesn't make business decisions based on sentimentality." "What about sound investment?" Thaddeus interjected. Preston raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "The current community center serves over 300 families. That's a built-in audience, a base of support. If we alienate them, we start from zero. Those families can't afford what we're building." "Not at full price, no," Thaddeus agreed. "But with scholarships, sliding scale fees, community partnerships, charity cases," Preston cut in dismissively. "Investment in future talent," Thaddeus countered. "Just like Grandma Barbara's music scholarship invested in you." Something flickered in Preston's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that Thaddeus would mention this. Zora glanced between them, sensing an old family tension. "My mother's hobby was different," Preston said stiffly. "Was it?" Thaddeus pressed. "You were a scholarship kid at Juilliard before you switched to business. First in the family to attend college." Zora hadn't known this. The piece of information shifted her perception of Preston Montgomery slightly. Not enough to like him, but enough to see him more clearly. "That was a different time," Preston said. "The need is the same," Zora said quietly. "Children with talent, but no opportunity. Like my grandmother." Preston's gaze sharpened. "Your grandmother?" "Ruby Willis." Zora opened her folder and placed the old photograph on his desk. "She played with Barbara Roswell in the 70s. before opportunities for musicians like her dried up. Preston picked up the photo, studying it for a long moment. His expression remained unreadable. "Barbara mentioned her," he said finally. "Said she was exceptional." She was. And there are children at that center right now with the same potential. Children who deserve the chance she never got. Preston set the photo down. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Willis?" Zora took a deep breath. This was the moment she'd prepared for all night. A true partnership. Keep the Ruby Willis music program as planned, but integrate it with the existing community programs. Provide scholarships for local children. Use the current staff who already have relationships with families. Make it a genuine community resource, not just a shiny amenity to sell condos. "And the business case?" Preston asked, turning to his son. "Tax benefits, positive publicity, community goodwill that translates to faster approvals for future projects." Thaddeus spoke the language his father understood. "Plus, Barbara has offered to match funding for the scholarship program." Preston's eyebrows rose slightly. "Has she now?" "She has," Thaddeus confirmed. "And I've committed personal funds as well, separate from the company's investment." A tense silence fell over the room. Preston tapped his fingers on the desk, considering. "I'll need to see numbers, projections, a business plan, not just good intentions." "We have those," Elijah said, pulling out his laptop. "I've been working with Mr. Davis at the center and some of my professors at school." Preston looked mildly surprised, as if noticing Elijah for the first time. "You're a business student?" "Urban planning," Elijah replied, "with a focus on equitable development." "Interesting." Preston nodded toward the laptop. "Show me." For the next 30 minutes, Elijah walked Preston through their proposal. Zora watched with pride as her younger brother held his own against one of the city's most powerful developers. Thaddeus occasionally added points about financing or logistics, but mostly let Elijah lead. When they finished, Preston leaned back in his chair, expression thoughtful. "It's not without merit," he admitted. "I'll need to review the numbers more thoroughly, of course." "Of course," Thaddeus agreed. "And what's your role in all this, Ms. Willis?" Preston asked, turning to Zora. "Besides being the namesake's granddaughter, I'd direct the music program," she said, working alongside Mr. Davis, who would continue leading the community center's other programs. "With what qualifications?" The question stung, but Zora kept her voice steady. "I've taught music for 2 years at the center. I know the children, the families, the community, and I can play." Preston's smile was thin. "So, I've heard. But running a program requires more than talent." "Dad," Thaddeus began, but Zora cut him off. "You're right," she said. "It requires commitment, understanding, respect for the people you're serving." She met Preston's gaze directly. "Things that can't be taught at Juilliard." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Preston Montgomery did something unexpected. He laughed, a short, sharp sound, but genuine. "You certainly don't lack confidence," he said. "I can see why my son and sister-in-law are so taken with you." He stood abruptly. "I'll consider your proposal. Thaddeus, have the legal team draft contingency plans for both scenarios. We'll decide by the end of the week." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. As they prepared to leave, Zora placed one more item on Preston's desk, her grandmother's unfinished composition. "One more thing," she said. "The opening event for the program. I'd like to perform this piece." Preston glanced at the yellowed sheet music. "What is it?" "My grandmother's last composition. She never finished it before she died. And you can play an unfinished piece? I'm going to finish it, Zora said, with Thaddeus's help. Both Preston and Thaddeus looked surprised. I wasn't aware you composed, son, Preston said. I don't, Thaddeus replied, but I know people who do. I see. Preston handed the music back to Zora. Well, Ms. Willis, you've certainly given me something to think about today. 3 months later, Zora stood before the mirror in Riverstone, club's private dressing room, hardly recognizing herself. The elegant blue dress was her own, purchased with her first paycheck as music program director. Her hair was styled in a way that would have made Grandma Ruby proud. Natural, but elegant, adorned with a single silver clip that had belonged to her grandmother. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. 5 minutes, Elijah called through. The door. House is packed. Zora took a deep breath. I'll be right out. In the hallway, Elijah waited with Mira, both dressed for the occasion. Nervous? Mira asked. Terrified, Zora admitted, but ready. They walked together toward the main room, which had been transformed into a concert space, where dining tables had once stood. Rows of chairs now faced a small stage. The grand piano gleamed under the lights. In the front row sat Thaddeus and Barbara, Preston Montgomery, Dominic Pierce, and Mr. Davis. Behind them, families from the community center mixed, with donors and city officials. And in the very back, a special section was reserved for the children from Zora's classes, dressed in their Sunday best, eyes wide with excitement. Thaddeus met her at the edge of the stage. Everything's ready, he said. Your grandmother's piano arrived this morning. What? Zora hadn't heard about this. He guided her to the side of the stage, where a familiar upright piano stood next to Riverstone's grand. It had been beautifully restored, the chipped keys replaced, the wood polished, to a warm glow. How did you? Barbara helped track it down. It was in a storage unit in Chicago. The previous owner was happy to sell it once we explained why we wanted it. Zora touched the piano gently, memories flooding back. Thank you, she whispered. There's something else, Thaddeus said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a small, worn record sleeve. Inside was a 45 RPM vinyl disc, its label faded but still legible. Montgomery Willis Quartet, Blue Note, 1973. I found it in my grandfather's things, Thaddeus explained. Turns out he was the saxophone player in that quartet. With your grandmother. Zora stared at the record, then at Thaddeus. Your grandfather played with my grandmother? Until my grandfather's family pressured him to quit music and join the family business. Thaddeus's smile was sad. Some patterns repeat across generations, I guess. Not all patterns, Zora said softly. Some we can break. As the house lights dimmed, Thaddeus squeezed her hand gently. Break a leg out there. Zora walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. She sat first at the grand piano, adjusting the microphone. Thank you all for coming tonight to the official opening of the Ruby Willis Community Music Center. I'd like to begin with a piece my grandmother never finished, her unfinished symphony. Thanks to the help of some talented musicians and composers, we've completed it. Not as she would have, perhaps, but as a bridge between past and present, between what was lost and what can still be found. She began to play, the rich notes filling the room. Halfway through, she moved to her grandmother's upright piano, continuing the piece on the instrument that had first taught her fingers to dance. As the final notes faded, Zora looked out at the audience, at the children who would now have opportunities her grandmother never had, at Elijah, whose future was now secure, at Thaddeus, whose eyes shone with something that looked remarkably like hope. Some symphonies remained unfinished, but others found their resolution across years, across generations, in harmonies no one could have predicted. Thanks for watching Unfinished Symphony. I'm curious, where are you tuning in from today? If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button to help spread a little kindness. And if you enjoyed this tale of unexpected connection and second chances, click on the video appearing on your screen right now for another story that will warm your soul. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share more stories with you soon.